The blast of the gunshot echoed across the dusty street of Fort Sumner, New Mexico, freezing every soul within earshot except for Abigail Foster, who remained terrified as the smoking barrel of Zachary Xavier's revolver pointed skyward. Just seconds before, she had been staring down the barrel of another man's gun, her wrists bound with coarse rope, as she was being forced onto a wagon headed for parts unknown. It was 1879, and Fort Sumner had seen its share of violence since the Lincoln County War had ended the previous year, but nothing quite like the scene unfolding in the center of town on this sweltering June afternoon. "Let her go," Zach commanded, his voice cutting through the heavy air with the authority of a man who meant every word. His tall frame cast a long shadow across the dirt road, his dark hat pulled low over piercing blue eyes that hadn't blinked since he'd fired the shot that sent the kidnapper's pistol spinning into the dust. Theodore Blackwell, a man with a reputation as cruel as the desert surrounding them, nursed his stinging hand while his two companions shifted nervously beside the wagon. Abigail stood frozen between them, her honey-colored hair falling loose from its pins, her green eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. "This ain't your business, Xavier," Blackwell snarled, his face twisted with rage. "The woman's spoken for, and I'm collecting what's mine." Zach kept his revolver steady, already cocked for a second shot if needed. "Seems to me a lady being forced at gunpoint isn't spoken for at all." His gaze flicked briefly to Abigail. "Madam, are you traveling with these men of your own free will?" Abigail found her voice, though it trembled. "No, sir. They ambushed me at my father's homestead. My father," her voice broke. "They killed my father when he tried to stop them." Something dangerous flickered in Zach's eyes. "That true, Blackwell? You adding murder to your list of crimes now?" The tension in the street pulled tight as a bowstring. Townspeople had scattered at the first gunshot, peering now from windows and doorways. The sheriff was nowhere to be seen, likely drunk at the saloon, as he often was by midday. "The old man shouldn't have interfered," one of Blackwell's men muttered, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Step away from the lady," Zach ordered, taking a step closer. "And untie her hands." Blackwell's laugh was ugly. "3 against 1, Xavier. You really want to die today?" "Wouldn't be 3 for long," Zach replied calmly. "And I'd take you first." Something in his voice, the cold certainty of a man who'd faced death before and wasn't afraid to meet it again, made Blackwell hesitate. His eyes darted around the street, noting the faces watching from the shadows, witnesses to whatever happened next. "Cut her loose," he finally ordered one of his men, who reluctantly pulled a knife and sliced through the ropes binding Abigail's wrists. The moment she was free, Abigail stumbled away from the wagon, rubbing her raw skin. Zach gestured with his revolver. "Miss, if you'd be so kind as to walk over this way." She didn't need to be told twice. Moving as quickly as her trembling legs would allow, she crossed to stand behind Zach, feeling safer with each step that took her away from Blackwell and his men. "This isn't over," Blackwell warned, his voice thick with menace. "That woman's father owed me, and I aim to collect one way or another." "Ride out, Blackwell," Zach said, his aim never wavering. "Ride out now and don't come back if you value your worthless hide." For a tense moment it seemed Blackwell might challenge him. Then, with a curse, he climbed onto the wagon seat. "Let's go, boys," he muttered to his companions. "There'll be another time." The wagon rattled away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Only when it had disappeared from sight did Zach holster his weapon and turn to face the woman he'd just rescued. "Are you hurt, miss?" "Foster." "Abigail Foster," she supplied, trying to compose herself despite the shock and grief threatening to overwhelm her. "And no, I'm not hurt, thanks to you, Mr. Zachary Xavier," he replied, removing his hat briefly in a gesture of respect that seemed at odds with the dangerous man who had faced down 3 armed criminals without flinching. "I'm sorry about your father." At the mention of her father, Abigail's composure cracked. "They shot him in cold blood. Just rode up to our homestead this morning," and a sob caught in her throat. "Let's get you somewhere safe," Zach said gently. "Blackwell isn't known for giving up easily." "I have nowhere to go," Abigail admitted, the reality of her situation crashing down around her. "Our homestead is 15 miles outside of town. I can't go back there alone, not with them still out there." Zach considered this, looking around at the curious eyes still watching from the safety of doorways and windows. "The hotel has a room for ladies in need. The owner's wife, Mrs. Hawkins, is a good woman. She'll see you're taken care of while we figure out what to do next." Abigail questioned, searching his face. "I'm not in the habit of leaving unfinished business, Miss Foster. Blackwell and his men need to answer for your father's murder, and until they do, you're not safe." He gestured toward the modest 2-story building down the street. "Shall we?" As they walked the short distance to the hotel, Abigail became acutely aware of her disheveled appearance, her dress torn and dirty from her struggles, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She tried to straighten her clothing, suddenly self-conscious in the presence of this composed stranger. "May I ask why you intervened, Mr. Xavier?" she asked, partly to distract herself from her appearance and partly out of genuine curiosity. Zach's expression remained unreadable. "I don't abide men who force women against their will, or murderers. Are you a lawman?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, madam. Just a man who prefers things to be done right." At the hotel, Mrs. Hawkins took one look at Abigail's condition and immediately took charge, ushering her inside with motherly efficiency and shooting Zach a look that demanded explanation. "Theodore Blackwell and his men killed her father and tried to take her by force," Zach explained quietly. "She needs a safe place to stay until I can take care of it." The older woman's face hardened at Blackwell's name. "Say no more. We've had trouble with that one before." She turned to Abigail with unexpected gentleness. "Come, dear, let's get you cleaned up and into some fresh clothes. I have a daughter about your size who won't mind sharing." Abigail turned to Zach before following Mrs. Hawkins. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "No need for that," he replied. "Get some rest, Miss Foster. I'll return later to check on you." As he turned to leave, Mrs. Hawkins called after him, "And where are you going, Zachary Xavier? Not to do anything foolish, I hope." He placed his hat back on his head, adjusting it with practiced ease. "Just going to have a word with our sheriff, see if he can be bothered to do his job for once." But as he stepped back into the bright sunlight, his thoughts were already racing ahead. The sheriff was useless, everyone knew it. If Blackwell and his men were to be brought to justice, Zach would have to see to it himself. And if keeping Abigail Foster safe meant putting himself between her and danger, then so be it. He hadn't planned on becoming entangled in someone else's troubles when he rode into Fort Sumner that morning. Yet something about Abigail's quiet dignity in the face of terror had struck a chord in him. It had been a long time since Zach had allowed himself to care about anything beyond his next meal and a safe place to sleep. A very long time indeed. In the room upstairs, Abigail sank onto the edge of the bed Mrs. Hawkins had offered her, finally allowing the tears to come. For her father, for the home she'd lost, and for the uncertain future that stretched before her. But mixed with her grief was something unexpected, a flutter of hope that had taken root the moment a stranger's steady hand had shot a gun from her captor's grasp and changed the course of her life forever. Abigail woke hours later to soft knocking at her door. The room had grown dark with the setting sun, and for a moment, Disorientation gripped her. Then the day's events came rushing back: her father's murder, the attempted kidnapping, and the intervention of the mysterious Zachary Xavier. "Who is it?" she called, her voice still rough from sleep and tears. "Mrs. Hawkins, dear, I've brought you some supper and news." Abigail hastily straightened the borrowed nightgown and wrapper before opening the door. Mrs. Hawkins entered carrying a tray with a steaming bowl of stew, fresh bread, and a cup of tea. "You must eat something," the older woman insisted, setting the tray on a small table. "It's been hours since you've had anything, I'm sure." The aroma of the stew awakened Abigail's hunger, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since breakfast with her father, a memory that sent a fresh wave of grief through her. She forced herself to sit and take a spoonful, knowing she needed strength. "What news do you have?" she asked, breaking off a piece of bread. Mrs. Hawkins settled herself in the room's single chair. "Mr. Xavier returned about an hour ago. He spoke with the sheriff, though from what I gather, it wasn't a productive conversation. The sheriff claims he can't spare men to track Blackwell down with so little evidence." "Little evidence?" Abigail's hand tightened around her spoon. "My father is lying dead in our home. I was bound and forced at gunpoint in the middle of town. I know, dear. It's shameful. But between you and me, the sheriff has been in Blackwell's pocket for years. Most folks around here know it, but there's little to be done about it." Abigail set down her spoon, appetite diminishing. "So they'll get away with it, with murder." Mrs. Hawkins reached across to pat her hand. "Mr. Xavier doesn't seem the type to let that happen. He's downstairs now, talking with some men he knows. Good men, from what I can tell." Hope flickered again in Abigail's chest. "He's still here, he's still helping. Indeed he is. Asked me to tell you he'd like to speak with you when you're feeling up to it." Mrs. Hawkins studied Abigail's face with shrewd eyes. "He's a good man, Zachary Xavier. Keeps to himself mostly, but always fair, always honest. Been staying here off and on for near 6 months now." "What does he do?" Abigail asked, curiosity getting the better of her. "Odd jobs, mostly. Some say he used to ride with the Rangers over in Texas, but he never speaks of it. Makes his living hunting, tracking, sometimes guiding folks through territory he knows." Mrs. Hawkins stood, smoothing her apron. "Finish your supper, dear. I'll tell him you'll see him in the morning. You need your rest tonight." After Mrs. Hawkins left, Abigail forced herself to eat, knowing she would need her strength in the days ahead. Her mind raced with questions and fears. What would happen to her father's body? To their homestead? And what did Blackwell mean when he said her father owed him? Her father, Samuel Foster, had been a quiet, hard-working man who kept mostly to himself. After Abigail's mother died of fever 5 years ago, it had been just the two of them working the small ranch outside of town. They raised a few cattle, grew enough crops to feed themselves, and lived simply. Her father had never mentioned any debts, especially not to a man like Theodore Blackwell. Sleep came fitfully that night, haunted by images of her father falling to Blackwell's bullet, and the terrifying journey into town with a gun pressed to her back. Each time she woke gasping, the same calming thought eventually lulled her back to sleep. The image of Zachary Xavier's steady hand and unflinching gaze as he faced down 3 armed men to save a woman he didn't even know. Morning came with soft golden light filtering through the curtains. Abigail dressed in the clothes Mrs. Hawkins had provided, a simple blue calico dress that was perhaps a touch too large but clean and whole. She brushed and pinned her hair as best she could with borrowed pins, wanting to present a more dignified appearance than yesterday's dishevelment. When she descended the stairs to the hotel's small dining room, she immediately spotted Zach at a corner table, deep in conversation with 2 other men. He looked up as if sensing her presence, and for a moment Their eyes locked across the room. Something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or understanding, before he nodded slightly and rose to his feet. "Miss Foster," he greeted as she approached. "I hope you were able to get some rest." "As much as could be expected," she replied honestly. "Mrs. Hawkins said you wished to speak with me." "Yes." He gestured to the men at the table. "These are friends of mine, Marcus Reeves and Daniel Thompson. They've agreed to help us with our problem." Abigail nodded politely to the men. Marcus was older, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of a man who'd spent his life outdoors. Daniel was younger, closer to Zach's age of what she guessed to be early 30s, with kind eyes that conveyed sympathy. "Please sit," Zach offered, pulling out a chair for her. Once she was seated, he continued, "First, I want you to know that Marcus and Daniel rode out to your homestead last night. They took care of your father." Tears sprang to Abigail's eyes at the gentle way he delivered this news. "Thank you," she whispered. "We laid him to rest proper, madam," Marcus said, his voice gruff but kind. "By that big oak tree on the eastern edge of your property. Seemed like a peaceful spot." Abigail nodded, unable to speak for a moment. It was her father's favorite place to sit in the evenings, watching the sunset over their modest land. "There's something else," Zach continued after giving her a moment to compose herself. "We found this in your father's desk." He placed a folded document on the table. With trembling fingers, Abigail unfolded the paper. It was a loan agreement signed by her father and Theodore Blackwell for the sum of $500. The terms were predatory, exorbitant interest that would double the debt in just 6 months. The date on the paper was from just 3 months ago. "I don't understand," she said, looking up in confusion. "My father never mentioned borrowing money, especially not from someone like Blackwell." Daniel leaned forward. "The drought last spring was hard on a lot of small ranchers. Your father may have needed the money to keep the place going after losing cattle. But why would he go to Blackwell instead of the bank? Banks don't always lend to small operations," Zach explained. "Especially with no collateral beyond land that's worth little in a drought." Abigail stared at the paper, trying to make sense of it all. "So Blackwell thinks this gives him the right to take me as payment?" Zach's jaw tightened. "Blackwell makes his own rules. My guess is he never intended for your father to be able to repay the loan. He wanted your land all along, and when your father couldn't pay, he decided to take me instead," Abigail finished, a cold realization settling in her stomach. "But why?" The 3 men exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Blackwell's been looking to expand his interests," Marcus said carefully. "He's been buying up small ranches all along the river, sometimes through legitimate means, sometimes not. Word is he's planning to control all the water access in the county." "And my father's land has the spring," Abigail said, understanding dawning. Their modest homestead's greatest asset was the reliable spring that provided water even in the driest seasons. "But that doesn't explain why he tried to take me." Zach's expression darkened. "Blackwell has other businesses in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. Establishments that cater to men with particular tastes." The implication hit Abigail like a physical blow. "He was going to sell me," she whispered, horror washing over her. "We won't let that happen," Zach said firmly, his hand briefly covering hers on the table. The touch was fleeting but reassuring. "But you need to understand what we're dealing with. Blackwell isn't going to give up easily, not on your land and not on you." Abigail took a deep breath, forcing down her fear and replacing it with resolve. "What do we do now?" Zach seemed slightly surprised by her directness, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "First, we need to secure your homestead. If Blackwell can't take legal possession, he might try to force you out by other means." "I can't go back there alone," she admitted. Not yet. You won't be alone, Zach assured her. I'll go with you, and Marcus and Daniel will help keep watch for a while. Between us, we can make sure Blackwell and his men don't try anything. And then what? We can't stand guard forever. No, Zach agreed. But we can gather evidence of Blackwell's crimes not just against your father, but others he's wronged. There are more than a few in these parts. If we can build a strong enough case, we might be able to get the territorial marshal involved, bypass the local sheriff entirely. Hope and determination began to replace the despair that had threatened to overwhelm Abigail since yesterday. When do we leave for the homestead? This afternoon, if you're up to it. The sooner we establish our presence there, the better. The men excused themselves shortly after to make preparations, leaving Abigail alone with her thoughts. She sat for a long moment, staring at the loan document that had cost her father his life. Mrs. Hawkins appeared at her side, refilling her coffee cup. "Those are good men," she said, nodding toward the door Zach and his friends had just exited through. "If anyone can help you make things right, it's them." "Why is Mr. Xavier doing this?" Abigail asked. "He doesn't know me. He doesn't owe me anything." Mrs. Hawkins smiled softly. "Some men just have a sense of what's right, dear, and some have ghosts that drive them to make sure others don't suffer the same fate." She patted Abigail's shoulder before moving away. Either way, you couldn't ask for a better champion. By early afternoon, Abigail found herself seated beside Zach on a wagon heading out of town toward her homestead. Marcus and Daniel followed on horseback, rifles visible across their saddles. Mrs. Hawkins had provided her with more borrowed clothing, enough to last a few days, packed neatly in a small valise at her feet. The journey was largely silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Abigail watched the landscape roll by the scrubby plains giving way to more varied terrain as they approached the foothills where her father had staked his claim 15 years ago. "Tell me about your father," Zach said suddenly, breaking the silence. "What kind of man was he?" Abigail glanced at him, surprised by the question. "He was kind, quiet. He loved this land even when it was hard and unforgiving, said it had character." A small smile touched her lips at the memory. "He came west from Virginia after the war. Said he'd seen enough of people to last a lifetime and wanted open spaces and honest work. You were close." "Yes. After my mother died, it was just the two of us. We managed well enough." She twisted her hands in her lap. "He taught me everything: how to shoot, how to ride, how to run the ranch. Said a woman in this territory needed to be as capable as any man." Zach nodded appreciatively. "Wise man." "What about your family, Mr. Xavier?" she asked, curious about the man who had so dramatically entered her life. A shadow crossed his face. "Don't have much family to speak of anymore. Father died in the war. Mother followed a few years after. Had a brother but lost touch after I left home." "Where was home?" "Texas, small place near Austin." His hands tightened briefly on the reins. "Left when I was 17, been moving ever since." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but Abigail didn't press. Everyone had parts of themselves they preferred to keep private. "I owe you my life, Mr. Xavier," she said instead. "Whatever your reasons for helping me, I'm grateful." His eyes met hers briefly before returning to the road ahead. "Zach," he said, "if we're going to be working together, you might as well call me Zach." The formality between them softened slightly with this small concession. "Then you must call me Abigail," she replied. "Or Abby, if you prefer." "My father always called me Abby." A hint of a smile touched Zach's lips. "Abigail suits you better, I think. Has strength to it." They crested a small rise, and suddenly the Foster homestead came into view in the valley below. It was a modest place, a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney. A barn, corral, and a few outbuildings. A small garden plot, now untended, sat near the house. Beyond it stretched grazing land that led down to the creek fed by the spring. But what caught Abigail's attention immediately was the fresh mound of earth beneath the oak tree on the eastern edge of the property. Her father's grave. Zach stopped the wagon, sensing her need for a moment. Without a word, he helped her down and stood respectfully aside as she walked to the grave. Marcus and Daniel halted their horses a distance away, giving her privacy. Abigail knelt beside the simple wooden cross they had placed to mark the spot. Her fingers traced the letters of her father's name carved into the wood. No tears came, she had shed enough the night before. Instead, a calm resolve settled over her. "I'll protect what you built, Father," she whispered. "I promise." When she returned to the wagon, her back was straight and her eyes clear. Zach studied her face, noting the transformation. This was not a woman who would be defeated by grief or fear. This was a woman who would fight. "Let's get settled in before dark," he said, offering his hand to help her back onto the wagon seat. The next few hours were filled with practical matters, checking the property for any signs that Blackwell's men had returned, assessing supplies, tending to the animals that had been left unattended since yesterday morning. The work was a blessing, giving Abigail something to focus on besides her loss. As dusk approached, she found herself in the kitchen preparing a simple meal from the provisions they had brought and what remained in the pantry. The familiar task was comforting, a small piece of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. Zach appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "Daniel's taking first watch tonight. We'll rotate every few hours." "Thank you." She gestured to the stew bubbling on the stove. "Supper will be ready soon if you'd like to wash up." He nodded and disappeared, returning a short while later with his face and hands clean, hair damp at the temples. Something about the sight of him standing in her kitchen, looking almost domesticated, struck Abigail with unexpected force. This dangerous, capable man who had faced down killers without flinching now seemed almost vulnerable in the soft evening light. They ate at the small kitchen table, joined by Marcus while Daniel kept watch outside. The conversation was minimal but not uncomfortable. After the meal, Marcus excused himself to rest before his watch shift, leaving Abigail and Zach alone. "You should try to get some sleep," Zach suggested, rising to help clear the dishes. "It's been a long couple of days." "I'm not sure I can sleep yet," she admitted. "Everything feels strange." Being here without him. Zach nodded in understanding. "First night's always the hardest. You speak from experience." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Yes." They worked together silently for a few minutes, washing and drying the dishes in a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. When they finished, Abigail found herself reluctant to end this moment of quiet companionship. "Would you like coffee?" she offered. "I could use some myself." Zach agreed, and soon they were seated before the small hearth in the main room, each with a steaming cup. The spring night had grown cool enough to warrant a small fire, which cast dancing shadows across the walls. "Tell me about Blackwell," Abigail said suddenly. "I need to know what we're facing." Zach studied his coffee for a moment before responding. "Theodore Blackwell came to New Mexico about 10 years ago. No one knows much about his past, but rumors say he fled Texas after killing a man or several men. Started small here, buying up a struggling saloon in Fort Sumner, then expanding to other businesses. Some legitimate, others not. Like the establishments you mentioned in Santa Fe." "Yes." His jaw tightened. "He preys on desperate people, offers loans they can't repay, then takes everything they have. Sometimes that includes their daughters or wives." Abigail shuddered. "And the law does nothing. Blackwell is clever." keeps his worst business far from Fort Sumner, spreads his operations across the territory so no single lawman has the full picture, and he's not above bribing or threatening those who might cause him trouble, like our sheriff. Exactly. Sheriff Daniels has been in Blackwell's pocket for years. Looks the other way when Blackwell's men cause trouble, dismisses complaints against them. Abigail absorbed this information, anger mixing with her fear. How many others have suffered because of him? How many families destroyed? Too many, Zach admitted. That's why stopping him matters. It's not just about your father or your land. It's about everyone he's hurt and everyone he will hurt if no one stands against him. Is that why you're helping me? To stop Blackwell? Zach's eyes met hers across the firelit space between them. Partly, he acknowledged. But also because no one should have to face this kind of evil alone. Something in his gaze made Abigail's heart quicken. There was compassion there, certainly, but something else too, a connection that had formed in the moment he'd shot the gun from Blackwell's man's hand. A connection that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing hour. "What happened to you, Zach?" she asked softly. "What made you the kind of man who would risk his life for a stranger?" For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down his cup and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I had a sister," he said finally, his voice low. 5 years younger than me. Beautiful girl, smart as a whip. Our mother died when I was 16, and I did my best to look after Sarah after that. But I was young, restless. When I was 20, I left home to make my fortune, told myself I'd send for her once I was established. Abigail remained silent, sensing the weight of the story he was sharing. I was gone 3 years. Worked cattle drives, tried my hand at mining, even rode with the Rangers for a while, when I finally went home. His voice faltered slightly. She was gone. My father had died, and she'd been taken in by a respectable businessman who promised to give her work in his hotel. Except it wasn't a hotel, it was a brothel in Galveston. Abigail's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Zach, by the time I found her, she was." He shook his head. "The man who took her, he was like Blackwell, respected in town, friends with the law, but rotten to the core. When I tried to take her away, he had me beaten and thrown in jail. By the time I got out, Sarah had." He couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm so sorry," Abigail whispered, her heart aching for his loss. "She took her own life rather than continue living as she was," Zach said, the words coming out rough and painful. "I buried her, and then I went after the man responsible. He died, and I've been running ever since. That was 10 years ago." Without thinking, Abigail moved to sit beside him, her hand covering his where it rested on his knee. "It wasn't your fault." His fingers curled around hers, holding on like a lifeline. "I should have been there to protect her. Just like your father should have been here to protect you tomorrow and the next day and the next. But life doesn't always give us what should be." They sat in silence, hands joined, as the fire crackled and popped in the hearth. Abigail understood now why Zach had intervened when he saw her being forced onto that wagon. In her, he had seen his sister's fate about to repeat itself, and something in him couldn't stand by and let it happen. "We're going to stop Blackwell," she said with quiet determination. "Not just for my father or your sister, but for everyone he would hurt if we don't." Zach looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing past the woman he'd rescued to the strength beneath. "Yes," he agreed, "we are." The moment stretched between them, charged with understanding and something more, something neither was ready to name. Finally, Zach gently disengaged his hand and stood. "You should get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be a busy day." Abigail nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. "Good night, Zach, and thank you for telling me about Sarah." "Good night, Abigail," he replied softly before slipping out into the night to take his turn at watch. Alone in her childhood bedroom, Abigail lay awake for a long time, thinking about the man keeping vigilance outside her home. A man shaped by tragedy yet not broken by it. A man who had saved her life and now risked his own to help her find justice. A man, she realized with a flutter of surprise, who was beginning to matter to her in ways that went beyond gratitude. The days that followed fell into a pattern as Abigail and Zach established a routine at the homestead. Each morning, they would share breakfast before tending to the necessary chores, feeding the animals, checking the fences, maintaining the property. Marcus and Daniel took turns riding into town for supplies and information, never leaving Abigail with less than 2 protectors at any time. On the 3rd day, they buried Samuel Foster's prize stallion, found shot in the pasture a clear message from Blackwell that he wasn't finished with them. That night, they doubled the watch. By the end of the 1st week, Abigail had begun to notice subtle changes in Zach. The guarded expression he wore like armor seemed to soften when they were alone. He spoke more freely, sometimes even smiled, a rare, transformative expression that made her heart beat faster each time she witnessed it. They developed a habit of sitting together in the evenings after supper, sometimes talking, sometimes just sharing comfortable silence. She told him about growing up on the homestead, about her mother's gentle wisdom and her father's determined optimism. He shared carefully selected stories from his years of wandering, amusing encounters on cattle drives, beautiful places he'd seen, characters he'd met along the way. What he didn't speak of was his life before Sarah's death, or the decade of drifting that followed. Those wounds, Abigail sensed, were still too raw to probe. On the 10th day, Marcus returned from town with news that set their plans in motion. "Blackwell's leaving for Santa Fe tomorrow," he reported as they gathered around the kitchen table, "taking most of his men with him. Word is he's got business that can't wait." "How long will he be gone?" Zach asked, immediately alert. 3 days, maybe 4. He's leaving just 2 men behind to watch his interests in Fort Sumner. Zach's eyes met Abigail's across the table. "This is our chance. While he's gone, we can gather the evidence we need against him." "What kind of evidence?" she asked. "Blackwell keeps records," Zach explained. "Ledgers documenting his loans, his property acquisitions, maybe even his other businesses. If we can get our hands on those, we could take them to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe," Daniel finished. "Bypass Sheriff Daniels entirely." "Exactly. And with Blackwell away, security at his office will be lighter than usual." Abigail frowned. "You're talking about breaking in." "That's dangerous and illegal." "So is murder," Zach countered, "and kidnapping, and everything else Blackwell's done." She couldn't argue with that logic. "So what's the plan?" "Marcus and Daniel will create a distraction tomorrow night. Something to draw Blackwell's remaining men away from his office. I'll slip in and find the ledgers." "I'm coming with you," Abigail said immediately. Zach shook his head. "Too risky. It's my father who was murdered, my land he's trying to steal." "My life he threatened," she insisted, her voice firm. "Besides, 4 eyes are better than 2. We'll find what we need faster if we work together." The men exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. "She has a point," Marcus conceded reluctantly. "And she's proven she can handle herself this past week." Zach still looked unconvinced, but Abigail held his gaze steadily. "I'm not asking permission, Zach. I'm going." Something flickered in his eyes, frustration, concern, and perhaps a hint of admiration. Finally, he nodded. "All right. But you stay close to me the entire time. No wandering off on your own." "Agreed." They spent the rest of the day and the following morning planning meticulously. By afternoon, Marcus had ridden into town to confirm Blackwell's departure and finalize their strategy. As dusk approached, Abigail changed into the darkest clothing. She owned a navy skirt and black shirtwaist that would blend into the shadows. She braided her hair tightly to keep it from catching on anything and tucked it under a dark kerchief. When she emerged from her room, she found Zach waiting in the hallway, similarly dressed in dark clothing, his gun belt secured around his waist. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes moving over her appraising. "As I'll ever be." The ride into town was tense and quiet. They left their horses with a sympathetic livery owner on the edge of town and proceeded on foot, keeping to the shadows. Fort Sumner was quiet at this hour, most respectable citizens at home for the evening, while those seeking entertainment gathered at the saloon on the other side of town. Blackwell's office was located above the Mercantile. He owned a two-story building with a balcony running along the second floor. They waited in an alley across the street, watching as Marcus entered the saloon where Blackwell's men were known to drink when their boss was away. "How long do we wait?" Abigail whispered, her pulse quickening with anticipation and fear. "Until we see the signal," Zach replied, his voice equally low. "When Marcus starts the fight, Daniel will light a match in that window across the street. That's when we move." The minutes stretched endlessly as they waited in tense silence. Finally, they heard a commotion from the direction of the saloon, shouting, the crash of breaking furniture, and then men spilling out onto the street. "There," Zach murmured as a brief flare of light appeared in the window across the way. "Let's go." They moved swiftly across the street, keeping low. The back stairs to Blackwell's office creaked slightly under their weight, but the noise from the disturbance at the saloon covered any sound they might make. At the top landing, Zach tried the door locked. As expected, from his pocket, he produced a set of slim metal tools. "Keep watch," he whispered as he knelt before the lock. Abigail positioned herself where she could see both the street below and the length of the balcony. Her heart pounded so loudly in her ears, she was certain anyone nearby would hear it. But the street remained empty, everyone's attention drawn to the brawl now spreading from the saloon. A soft click announced Zach's success with the lock. He eased the door open carefully, and they slipped inside, closing it behind them. The office was dark except for the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. Zach produced a small, hooded lantern from inside his coat and lit it, adjusting the shutter to provide just enough light to see by without being visible from outside. "Start with the desk," he instructed in a hushed voice. "I'll check the cabinet." They worked quickly, methodically, searching through drawers and shelves. Abigail found correspondence related to Blackwell's legitimate businesses, the Mercantile, a share in the saloon, some cattle trading, but nothing incriminating. "Here," Zach called softly, kneeling before a small safe he'd discovered behind a painting. "This is promising. Can you open it?" "Maybe." He pressed his ear to the door, turning the dial slowly, listening for the mechanisms within. It was painstaking work, and Abigail found herself holding her breath as the minutes ticked by. Finally, with a soft click, the safe door swung open. Inside were several leather-bound ledgers and a stack of documents. Zach quickly leafed through them, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "This is what we need," he confirmed. "Loan records, property transfers, and this." He held up a smaller book with a red cover. "Records of girls sent to his establishments in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. Names, ages, prices paid." Abigail felt sick. "Take them all." Zach tucked the books into a canvas bag he'd brought for the purpose. Just as he was closing the safe, they heard footsteps on the balcony outside. They froze, exchanging alarmed glances. Zach immediately extinguished the lantern, plunging the room into darkness. He pulled Abigail behind the desk. both of them crouching low as the door handle turned. One of Blackwell's men entered, muttering to himself about the disturbance at the saloon. He struck a match to light the lamp on the desk, and in its brief flare, Abigail caught a glimpse of his face, one of the men who had been with Blackwell the day her father was killed. Rage and fear surged through her in equal measure. Beside her, Zach's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezing in silent warning to remain still. The man moved around the office, seemingly looking for something. He came dangerously close to their hiding place, and Abigail held her breath, certain he would discover them at any moment. Then mercifully a shout came from outside. "Johnson, get back here! They're tearing the place apart!" With a curse, the man abandoned his search and hurried from the office, not bothering to extinguish the lamp in his haste. As soon as his footsteps faded, Zach and Abigail rose from their hiding place. "We need to go." "Now," Zach said urgently, securing the bag of ledgers. They slipped out onto the balcony, closing the door behind them. Rather than risk the stairs where they might be seen, Zach led Abigail to the edge of the balcony. "We'll have to jump," he whispered, nodding toward a stack of crates below that would break their fall. Without hesitation, Abigail gathered her skirts and climbed over the railing. Zach went first, landing softly on the crates and then reaching up to help her down. His hands at her waist steadied her as she jumped, the brief contact sending an unexpected thrill through her despite the danger of their situation. They fled through the back alleys of Fort Sumner, making their way to the livery where their horses waited. The ride back to the homestead was swift and tense, both of them constantly checking for pursuit. Only when they were safely inside, doors barred behind them, did Abigail finally release the breath she felt she'd been holding since they entered Blackwell's office. Zach spread the ledgers on the kitchen table, and by lamplight, they examined their findings. The evidence was damning, detailed records of Blackwell's predatory loans, properties acquired through intimidation and fraud, and worst of all, the trafficking of young women to his establishments in larger towns. "This is enough," Zach said, closing the red ledger with disgust. "More than enough to put him away for years, maybe for life. If we can get it to the right authorities," Abigail reminded him. "Ones Blackwell hasn't bought." "There's a territorial marshal in Santa Fe I trust," Zach replied. "An honest man with no ties to Blackwell. I'll take these to him tomorrow. I'm coming with you." Zach looked as if he might argue, then thought better of it. "All right, we'll both go. Marcus and Daniel can watch the homestead." They stayed up late into the night discussing their plans and reviewing the evidence. As exhaustion finally began to overtake them, Abigail found herself studying Zach's face in the lamplight, the strong lines of his jaw, the intensity of his eyes as he read through Blackwell's records. In just over a week, this man had become central to her world in ways she could never have imagined. "What?" he asked, catching her gaze. "I was just thinking. I barely know you, yet I trust you with my life." A small smile touched his lips. Sometimes life throws people together in ways that strip away all the usual pretenses. Danger has a way of revealing true character. "And what has it revealed about me?" she asked, curious. His eyes held hers steadily. "That you're stronger than you look, braver than most men I've known, and stubborn enough to make a mule look reasonable." The last part made her laugh, breaking the tension that had built between them. "Fair assessment. And what about you? What has this revealed about Zachary Xavier?" His smile faded, replaced by a thoughtfulness that made him seem suddenly vulnerable. "That maybe I've been running too long. That maybe there are things worth staying for." The implication of his words hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Abigail's heart beat faster as she realized what he might be saying, and what she wanted him to be saying, Before either could speak further, the sound of hooves outside drew their attention. Marcus and Daniel had returned from town. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, a recognition of possibilities that hadn't existed before. As they prepared for their journey to Santa Fe the following morning, Abigail found herself wondering what would happen after Blackwell was brought to justice, after the immediate danger had passed. Would Zach continue his wandering ways, or would he find reason to stay? And if he stayed, what might grow between them in days not shadowed by fear and revenge? The road to Santa Fe stretched across 80 miles of varied terrain from the grassy plains near Fort Sumner to more rugged country as they approached the territorial capital. Abigail and Zach rode at a steady pace, making camp the first night by a small creek. The precious ledgers remained secure in Zach's saddlebags, never far from his sight. They shared a simple meal cooked over a small fire, their conversation easier now than it had been in the tense days at the homestead. As night deepened around them, Abigail found herself drawn to ask the question that had been on her mind. "What will you do after this is over, Zach?" He was silent for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "Hadn't thought that far ahead," he admitted finally. "Been living day to day for so long, it's hard to imagine much beyond the next sunrise. Do you ever get tired of wandering?" His eyes met hers across the flames. "More lately than ever before." The implication warmed her more than the fire. "My father always said a man needs roots as much as he needs wings, that both are necessary for a life well lived. Your father was a wise man." Zach set aside the stick and leaned back against his saddle. "What about you, Abigail? What will you do when this is over? Keep the homestead going, I suppose. It's all I know." She smiled wistfully. "Though it will be lonely without father." They didn't speak further on the subject, but something had been acknowledged between them, a possibility, a hope for something beyond the immediate crisis that had brought them together. They reached Santa Fe by midday on the second day of their journey. The territorial capital was a bustling place compared to Fort Sumner, with its mix of Spanish and American influences evident in the architecture, and the diverse people moving through its streets. Zach led the way confidently to a modest government building near the plaza. "Marshal Thomas Crawford," he explained as they dismounted. "Served with him briefly during my ranger days. If anyone can be trusted with this, it's him." Crawford proved to be a solidly built man in his 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor that softened visibly when he recognized Zach. They were shown to a private office where Abigail told her story, her father's murder, her near kidnapping, and everything they had discovered about Blackwell's operations. The marshal listened intently, his expression growing darker as she spoke. When Zach produced the ledgers, Crawford examined them with growing disgust. "This is damning evidence," he confirmed. "More than enough to put Blackwell away for a very long time." He looked up at them. "But you understand that bringing him in won't be simple. Men like Blackwell don't surrender easily." "We understand," Zach replied. "But it needs to be done." Crawford nodded. "I'll gather a few trusted deputies and ride for Fort Sumner tomorrow. In the meantime, I suggest you two stay here in Santa Fe. There's a decent hotel down the street where I can arrange rooms for you." As they left the marshal's office, Abigail felt lighter than she had in weeks. For the first time since her father's murder, justice seemed possible, even likely. "What do you think?" Zach asked as they walked toward the hotel. "Do you trust Crawford to handle this?" "I do," she replied. "He seems like a good man, and having the law on our side for a change feels right." They checked into the hotel's separate rooms, of course, though adjacent to each other. After the trail dust was washed away, and they had changed into clean clothes, they met for dinner in the hotel's modest dining room. Over a meal far more elaborate than anything they'd eaten at the homestead, they allowed themselves to relax slightly, to enjoy a moment not overshadowed by immediate danger. Zach even smiled more freely, and Abigail found herself captivated by the transformation. "You should do that more often," she said when he laughed at something she'd said. "Do what? Smile. It suits you." A hint of color touched his cheeks the first time she'd seen him anything close to embarrassed. Haven't had much cause for it in recent years. Perhaps that could change. She surprised herself with her boldness. His eyes held hers, serious now. Perhaps it already has. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of the waiter with dessert, but the air between them remained charged with unspoken possibilities. They retired to their rooms early, tired from the journey and the emotional weight of reliving Abigail's ordeal for Marshall Crawford. At her door, Zach paused. "We should be safe here," he assured her. "But if you need anything during the night, I'll call for you," she promised. Then impulsively, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. "Thank you, Zach, for everything." Before he could respond, she slipped into her room, heart pounding at her own daring. Through the door, she heard him stand there for a long moment before his footsteps moved away to his own room. Abigail slept poorly that night, her mind racing with thoughts of Blackwell, of justice for her father, and most persistently, of Zach. By morning, she had come to a decision about what she wanted for her future, if only she could find the courage to voice it. They met Crawford again that morning to finalize plans. The marshal would leave with 4 deputies immediately, expected to reach Fort Sumner by the following afternoon. If all went well, they would take Blackwell into custody when he returned from his business in Santa Fe. "I want to be there when you arrest him," Abigail insisted. Crawford frowned. "That's not advisable, Miss Foster. This could get dangerous." "It's already dangerous," she countered. "It's my father he murdered. I deserve to see justice done." The marshal looked to Zach, who shrugged slightly. "I've learned it's easier not to argue with her once her mind is made up." Crawford sighed. "Fine, but you'll stay back, well out of harm's way." "Both of you," he added with a pointed look at Zach. "I know your reputation, Xavier. No heroics." "Wouldn't dream of it," Zach replied, though his slight smile suggested otherwise. They left Santa Fe that afternoon, riding at a more leisurely pace than their journey to the capital. There was no need to rush. Crawford and his men would reach Fort Sumner before them regardless. That night, they made camp beside a small spring sheltered by cottonwood trees. As they sat beside the fire after their meal, Abigail found herself studying Zach openly, trying to read the thoughts behind his quiet expression. "You're staring," he observed without looking up from the stick he was whittling. "I'm thinking," she corrected, "about the future." After Blackwell, he set down his knife and the half-carved piece of wood. "And what do you see in this future?" Abigail took a deep breath. "I see my homestead, the land my father loved, but I don't see myself there alone." His eyes lifted to meet hers, cautious hope visible in their depths. "Who do you see with you?" "A man who's been running too long. A man who might be ready for roots as well as wings." She held his gaze steadily. "A man I've come to care for more than I thought possible in so short a time." Zach set aside his carving and moved to sit beside her. "Abigail, I'm not sure I'm the kind of man who deserves what you're offering." "Because of your past," she shook her head. "We all have ghosts, Zach. The question is whether we let them haunt us forever or finally lay them to rest." Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out to touch her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek with a gentleness that belied the strength she knew those hands possessed. "I've been alone so long," he murmured. "I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else." "Then let me remind you," she whispered, leaning into his touch. When his lips met hers, It was with a tenderness that made her heart ache. The kiss deepened slowly, years of loneliness and weeks of growing feelings converging in a moment that changed everything. When they finally parted, Zach rested his forehead against hers. "I can't promise I'll be any good at staying in one place." She smiled. "I'm not asking for promises, just possibilities. Possibilities I can offer." He kissed her again briefly, and hope, for the first time in a very long time. They spent the evening by the fire, talking of small things, learning each other in ways they hadn't before. Zach spoke more freely of his past, not just the tragedy of his sister, but the good memories, too, of his childhood in Texas, of his mother's cooking and his father's quiet strength. When they retired to their separate bedrolls, something fundamental had shifted between them. The future, which had seemed so uncertain just days ago, now held the promise of something neither had dared hope for. They reached Fort Sumner the following afternoon to discover Crawford and his deputies had already arrived and established themselves at the town's small hotel. The marshal had learned that Blackwell was expected to return that evening. "We'll take him when he reaches his office," Crawford explained as they gathered in his hotel room. "Better to catch him somewhere private than risk a public confrontation where innocent people might be hurt." The plan was simple. Crawford and 2 deputies would wait inside Blackwell's office, while the others positioned themselves outside to ensure no one escaped. Zach and Abigail would wait at the hotel until it was over. "I still want to see him arrested," Abigail insisted. Crawford frowned. "It's too dangerous." "We'll watch from across the street," Zach suggested as a compromise. "Out of harm's way but close enough to witness justice being done." The marshal reluctantly agreed, and as dusk fell, they took up their position in the shadows of a building opposite Blackwell's office. Crawford and his men were already in place, having entered the building through the back after bribing the owner of the mercantile below to look the other way. The wait seemed interminable. Zach stood slightly behind Abigail, his presence reassuring in the growing darkness. When his hand found hers, she held onto it like an anchor in a storm. Finally, a wagon appeared at the end of the street, drawn by a pair of fine black horses. Theodore Blackwell sat on the driver's bench, another man beside him. "That's him," Abigail whispered, her voice tight. "The one who killed my father." Zach's hand tightened around hers. "It's almost over," he murmured. They watched as Blackwell dismounted and handed the reins to his companion. He looked much as Abigail remembered, expensively dressed, confident, utterly untroubled by the crimes he had committed. He entered the building alone, climbing the stairs to his office with the easy stride of a man who believed himself untouchable. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then shouts erupted from the upstairs windows, followed by the crash of furniture being overturned. A gunshot cracked through the night air, followed by another. Abigail gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Zach pulled her closer, his body tense as they waited to see what would happen next. The door of the office burst open, and Blackwell staggered onto the balcony, blood visible on his shirt. He fired a shot back into the room, then turned to flee down the stairs. "He's getting away," Abigail cried. But as Blackwell reached the bottom of the stairs, the 2 deputies stationed there stepped from the shadows, their guns leveled at his chest. "Theodore Blackwell," one called clearly, "you're under arrest for murder, kidnapping, and trafficking. Drop your weapon." For a moment it seemed Blackwell might choose to fight. Then, assessing the odds, he slowly lowered his gun to the ground. As they watched Crawford emerge from the building to formally take Blackwell into custody, Abigail felt tears streaming down her face, not of sorrow, but of relief and vindication. Zach's arms came around her from behind, holding her steady as emotion overwhelmed her. "It's done," he murmured against her hair. Your father can rest in peace now." They remained in Fort Sumner for 2 more days while Crawford took statements from witnesses and prepared to transport Blackwell to Santa Fe for trial. During that time, word spread through town about Blackwell's arrest and the crimes he was accused of. Many who had suffered under his influence came forward with their own stories, strengthening the case against him. On the morning they were to return to the homestead, Crawford sought them out. "Thought you'd want to know," he said. "We found more evidence in a hidden compartment in Blackwell's desk, records going back 15 years, including information about his operations in Texas." He looked meaningfully at Zach. "There's documentation about a brothel in Galveston. Names of girls purchased, dates." Zach stiffened. "Sarah Xavier," Crawford nodded solemnly, "listed among those who died while in his employment." "I'm sorry, Zach." Abigail watched as a complex mixture of emotions crossed Zach's face: grief, rage, and finally a sort of peace. "Thank you for telling me," he said quietly. "There's more," Crawford continued. "The man Blackwell worked for in Galveston, the one you killed, he deserved what he got. He was responsible for the deaths of at least a dozen young women over the years. No one will be looking too hard for his killer anymore." The implications were clear. Zach no longer needed to run. The ghosts of his past could finally be laid to rest. They rode back to the homestead in thoughtful silence, each processing the events of the past days in their own way. As the familiar buildings came into view, Abigail found herself seeing them with new eyes, not just as reminders of what she had lost, but as possibilities for what might be. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Zach took her hand in his. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice hesitant but determined, "about possibilities, about staying in one place." Abigail's heart quickened. And I think I'd like to try it, here if you'll have me." She turned to face him fully. "Are you sure? This is a quiet life, very different from what you're used to." "I've had enough excitement to last several lifetimes," he replied with a small smile. "Quiet sounds peaceful, it can be," she agreed. "But there's work too. Hard work every day. I'm not afraid of work." His thumb traced patterns on the back of her hand. "What I'm afraid of is waking up 10 years from now and realizing I walked away from the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too stubborn or too scared to change." Abigail leaned forward to kiss him softly. "Then stay. Not just for now, but for good." "For good," he echoed, the words a promise. In the weeks that followed, they settled into a new rhythm together. Zach proved to be a capable rancher, quick to learn the specific challenges of the Foster homestead. Word came from Santa Fe that Blackwell's trial was scheduled, and both Abigail and Zach would be called to testify. One evening, as they finished repairing a section of fence together, Zach paused, looking out over the land that was becoming as much his as hers. "I never thought I'd find this," he said quietly. "Find what? Home." He turned to her, his expression open in a way it hadn't been when they first met. "Someone to build a life with." Abigail set down her tools and moved to stand before him. "Is that what we're doing, building a life?" In answer, Zach reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, simple ring, a band of silver with a single modest stone. "If you'll have me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just as a partner in running this place, but as a husband." Tears sprang to Abigail's eyes as she held out her trembling hand. "Yes," she whispered as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "Yes, I'll have you, Zachary Xavier, for all the days to come." They were married a month later in a small ceremony at the homestead, with Marshal Crawford, Marcus, Daniel, and Mrs. Hawkins in attendance. As they spoke their vows beneath the oak tree where Samuel Foster rested, Abigail felt her father's presence, his approval of the man she had chosen. Theodore Blackwell was convicted of multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, fraud, and trafficking. He was sentenced to hang, a fate many felt was too merciful for the suffering he had caused. When news of his execution reached them, Abigail and Zach marked the occasion quietly, acknowledging the justice it represented without celebration. Life settled into a pattern of work and companionship, challenges and joys shared equally. Zach occasionally took on work as a guide for travelers, or helped the marshal when particular skills were needed, but always returned to the homestead to Abigail with a sense of coming home that he had never known before. 2 years after their marriage, their first child was born, a son they named Samuel, after Abigail's father. As Zach held his infant son, looking down into the face that represented all their hopes for the future, he made a silent promise to the memory of his sister and to Abigail's father. This child would grow up safe, loved, and free from the shadows that had once defined his own life. "He's perfect," Abigail whispered from where she rested in their bed. "He is," Zach agreed, carefully placing the baby in her arms before sitting beside her, just like his mother. As the evening light bathed the bedroom in gold, Zach thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the moment he saw a woman being forced onto a wagon at gunpoint to this quiet, perfect moment with his family. From a man defined by loss and revenge to one defined by love and purpose. "What are you thinking about?" Abigail asked, noting his contemplative expression. "About how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best," he replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "If I hadn't been in town that day, if I hadn't seen what was happening to you." "But you were, and you did," she said simply. "And here we are." Here they were indeed, not at the end of a story, but at the beginning of one that would continue through all the years to come. A story of a homestead in New Mexico territory, of land nurtured and children raised, of love that had bloomed from the ashes of tragedy. And as the sun set over the land they both now called home, Zachary Xavier finally understood what it meant to be truly at peace, to have both roots and wings, and the wisdom to know when to use each.